Ladies and gentlemen, my name is NicoNicoNico, but of course you can call me Nico. I hate how games are reviewed. Reviews are subjective, of course. You're reviewing art after all. There's got to be a little leeway, but I think everyone knows that game reviews are a bit off. The gaming industry is an extremely incestuous relationship between companies and journalists. Because game journalism is online, you need to put out articles quite fast, and this forces game journalists to basically speedrun games, not fully exploring them, in order to put out a review. The fan bases in video game communities can be quite volatile online as well. I'm sure that's a factor in many reviewers' minds. But the one aspect I really wanted to focus on was the 1 through 10 system and how it's been broken for years. Now, plenty of reviewers in plenty of different mediums use the 1 through 10 system, but it's a little bit different for games. Let's look at movies, for example. If a movie's ranked 1, 2, or 3, we can expect them to be pretty bad. 4, 5, and 6 are mediocre movies, but may have worthy elements. 7 to 8, they're great. And 9 to 10 are generally amazing movies that are very worthy of the praise that they get. However, in the video game community, those numbers mean different things. 1 through 6 are bad games that didn't pay off reviewers. 7 is a bad game that did pay off the reviewers. 8 through 9 are generally good games. And 10s, while sometimes masterpieces, are generally just extremely well-marketed, good games. Plus, these numbers really don't mean anything. Not only do different writers have different standards, different games can't be measured using this system. The classic example is Imagine Party Babies, rated by IGN as a 7.5. Does that mean that Dragon's Dogma, also rated by IGN as a 7.5, is equal in quality to Party Babies' penultimate title? No, obviously not. But therein lies the problem. The numbers mean nothing, especially when you try to compare them to other games. The system is usually accompanied by a few paragraphs of examination by the reviewer, but usually those are subjective. Really, I found very few game reviewers or reviews in general that I trust. I encountered this problem years ago when I tried to review games with my friends, and I found that that system never really gave a common language to gaming. It never really allowed game reviews to communicate between one another. I think the highest degree of analysis comes not when you analyze a single piece of media, but compare it to other similar media who maybe use similar choices or maybe none at all. With this system of reviewing, I don't see that happening. So I thought up a different system. This isn't totally original, obviously. I have a lot of credit to give to online threads where people argued constantly about whether or not games were good for different reasons. In the end, I think this might be the best way to review games, and I plan on using this channel to do so. Now, these threads commonly argued which of these 4 categories were the most important to a video game: gameplay, story, graphics, and music. I think this is a pretty good system compared to the 1 through 10 system, and it allows a reviewer to express what they find most important in games. Maybe you want to follow a reviewer who values story more than gameplay. I personally used to rank them gameplay, then story, with graphics and music equal at the end. But I always found that lacking, in a way. I think you can make examples of all of these being more or less important depending on the game. For example, I couldn't imagine getting rid of music or graphics, although I place story and gameplay above both of them. I think they're important in their own ways. So I tinkered with it a bit, and I ended up using this system, which uses 3 categories to analyze games. The first category is gameplay, obviously. One of the most important ones. This is how the player interacts with the world. It's not simply the combat of a game, but every decision you make, from moving around to making choices in dialogue. And in my opinion, you can really measure a game based on how engaging it is to actually interact with the game world. Some people believe that games need to be fun, and I agree, a game needs to have fun elements, but there are games that are extremely engaging that I would rank higher than a lot of fun video games. I don't think Silent Hill's combat is particularly fun, for example. It's almost purposefully designed to be bad in order to give you a sense of dread in the game world. But at the same time, I think that mechanic and that decision makes it rather engaging. Not every game needs to have gameplay like Yakuza, but it needs to have purpose within the game world. It needs to contribute to an overall vision. The second category is narrative. And this is how the game interacts with the player. This is how the game introduces story elements to the player. And I include story and characters in this category together. In the end, some people might say gameplay will be always more important than this category, but I think that if you really take the time to look at what makes games great, we've moved past simply having amazing gameplay into a realm where games need to motivate the player. You're trying to express ideas through every aspect, and the story is no exception. Now, the third and final category is aesthetics. Here, I combine visuals and music. I think that both are very important in creating a sense of presentation to the game world. Really, this entire category is the way the game presents itself. And to that end, I also include the medium that the game presents itself. Some people say that this category doesn't matter as much, but I think it's just as, if not more important in some cases, to gameplay and narrative. For example, if I were to give you the option of playing Guitar Hero, or a simple rhythm game clone made in Flash, I think more people would choose Guitar Hero. Not only do its visuals and its music really lend to a unique rock and roll aesthetic, the controller used, the guitar that has the green, red, yellow, orange buttons on it, gives a great sense of feedback that simply tapping away on a keyboard does not really match up to. Now, every game focuses on these different categories more than others, even in the same genre. For instance, I wouldn't complain about mediocre gameplay in a visual novel, as the bulk of the focus should be on the narrative and aesthetics. However, I'm not going to ignore when a visual novel manages to put choices in front of the player, have a unique spin on the genre, like Doki Doki Literature Club, for example. Now, in the same vein, a fighting game usually has a terrible main story, I think we can all admit that, but when so much of the focus is put on smoothing out gameplay and making sure the online play is crisp, you can't really argue that this takes too much away from a game, and if you were to, I don't think that's fair to it. Analyzing games with this method allows you to take this factor into account. It allows you to give games leeway while not betraying your audience. The people who are tuning in to see you not only give your own account of the experience, but an objective one as well. Now, in my opinion, taking all of these factors into account and seeing how they interact with one another reveals the game developer's vision and can accurately break down not only entire games, but individual micro pieces of the game. I'm going to use an example from one of my favorite games, Spyro the Dragon. So in Spyro, you play as a dragon, and your health is determined by a dragonfly named Sparks, who flies around your head. If you've never seen him, he's a little yellow bug that flies around your screen. He's barely noticeable normally, but when you check your health, it's easy to find Sparks on screen. Not only does he track your health in a rather uniquely integrated way, he also collects the small collectibles, which are gems, throughout the game, making it much easier for you to run right by them and have him pick up the leftovers. Narrative-wise, he's the player's only real companion throughout the story. There are characters in Spyro who assist the player, but none who really go the same distance that Spyro goes besides Sparks. He really sticks with the player throughout the entire game, and he may be lacking somewhat in personality, but the fact that he's there and visible on screen and has a real effect on gameplay really makes you attached to him. Aesthetics-wise, he naturally fits into the scene. He buzzes louder when he goes to grab gems and is a lot quieter when he's just floating around normally, and he eats bugs to regain health, which is always fun to look at. But the unique thing is when the player loses Sparks. The player is aware they have no health, gameplay. Your game-long companion is missing because you were careless during gameplay or you got into a dire situation, narrative. And the buzzing is gone, the flying companion is gone, the game feels more empty and more anxiety-inducing given that you have no health in this situation. Aesthetics. And it's when a game utilizes gameplay, narrative, and aesthetics together so well, like they have with Sparks, that you get a player much more attached to the world. It really goes to show an amazing game designer when they can blend these three elements together, and I found this pretty consistent, which is why I still use this system today. Now, of course, a game isn't simply objective points that you make a list of and then throw out into the world. A game can be art if it's done correctly. You can't simply break down every single piece of art and expect to understand it. Now, art, as I usually define it, is an expression that reveals a piece of the human experience. Now, for instance, I don't think anyone would argue that a movie can be art. But at the same time, I don't think that anyone would also argue that an hour and a half of watching paint dry counts as art. In the same way, cakes, although I think they can be beautiful and delicious, unless they really invoke a certain idea or emotion, you can't really call them art in the same way that you can a great movie. Similarly, video games can be art if they're done correctly, and this can't really be measured in an objective way. Of course, you can break down everything to its essential components and understand where the artistry lies, but that doesn't really show the person, the art, behind the game. Now, I recently watched a YouTuber who broke Oblivion down into its most bare-bones components in a 12-hour-long video essay, which I will link to in the description below. In it, he revealed the glaring flaws with the game, how systems clashed against one another, and how poorly designed even basic systems like leveling were. I would agree, of course. When you put everything out plainly and see all of its pieces, it's easy to see why one would hate the game, and it makes you wonder why there are so many fans of it. But actually experiencing the game is different. When you wander through the fields of Tamriel and you get attacked by a minotaur, and you have to use spells you've crafted and swords you've found, using your skills that you've developed throughout the game in order to defeat it with only a little bit of health remaining, and then you look up and see that the days turn to night, the battlefield's bloody, and your horse is waiting for you along the path, you create a moment in time in that game that's uniquely your own. Now, I wouldn't call Oblivion the best example of art in video games, far from it, but it's moments like this that make me realize the connection I have to a game. It's moments like this that reveal the love that was put in, uniquely to our medium, not only by developers, but the effort put in by the player, by myself. I remember small, intense moments like that, where the game systems managed to come together beautifully, even though all the pieces mismatched and everything seems to fall apart when you examine it. And it becomes something more than the sum of its parts. It becomes something special. It becomes a piece of art that sticks with you for the rest of your life. And I remember that moment in Oblivion much more vividly than any single match I've had in a fighting game or some generic online shooter. Now, ultimately, I don't think games have gotten the love they deserve in a lot of ways. But using this system, where you're able to analyze gameplay, narrative, and aesthetics, I can much more clearly see the developer's vision, and even understand better the art that springs to life from them. And in some extremely unique cases, I'm able to understand myself a little better as well. I'll be using the system in the future, so please stay tuned by subscribing. I hope to have videos at least weekly, but I'll be working with my schedule to give more as my time permits. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you have a lovely evening.